I feel like talking, so I think what we'll do is we'll get started, if you don't mind. My name is Mark Webster. I'm the president of the Friends of the Jefferson Law Library. This is part of a speaker series that we have. Thank you for coming. I just want to tell you our next one is 2 weeks from today. The candidate for the U.S. Senate, Charles Booker, will be speaking here today, July 30th at 12 noon.
For real this time.
For real. We had a glitch the last time, but he'll be here. And we have other speakers throughout the rest of the year. You can get a schedule out front. I wanted to introduce our speaker here, Denis Fleming, and I wanted to say a little bit about the book. He's going to talk about the book. But I read this book and I enjoyed it so much. I wanted to point out that he's got some books with him if you want to talk to him about the books. Also, he's got a new book coming out on January 5 concerning, I would say, Virginia politics, Patrick Henry, Nichols, who's mentioned.
Nichols back
Yeah.
before he came to Kentucky.
Yeah, Nichols, who's mentioned here. Yeah. So in other words, I would encourage you to get the book. But I wanted to make a little plug here just for a second. This book is about separation of powers. You probably were sleeping in grade school when they talked about it. But I think it is the issue in the U.S. Constitution. And I would urge you to do three things, and you could take the rest of your life to do this, is read the U.S. Constitution, read the Kentucky Constitution, and then read the Federalist Papers, which are about the U.S. Constitution.
And then read this book.
And then, but this book is this is the way a book ought to be. It's mercifully short and filled with information. But I wanted to say something about separation of powers with your.
Sure.
I think Cass Sunstein, the writer. I don't know if you know. He has a new book out on that.
That's the center of the whole book. That whole Jefferson was worried about it until 3 weeks before he died. He was writing letters to people about how critical it was to have an independent judiciary.
Exactly. Well, that's the thing here that I wanted to set this up, that the U.S. Constitution has a separation of, I guess, soft corners, you might say. And that's hard to think about. We think of, we have the separation of powers. There are three of them. There's the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. Now, there was a senator from Alabama recently who lives in Florida. He's running for governor of Alabama now, who couldn't name all three of those, and I won't mention his name. His name is Tuberville, okay? So anyway, the point about it being is that the U.S. Constitution powers have soft corners, so to speak. In other words, they overlap in some ways. For example, a president can declare war, but he has to have the consent of Congress. A president can nominate a cabinet member or officer, but he has to have the consent of the Senate. The Senate can pass a law, but the executive can veto, and then the Congress can override the veto, and the United States Supreme Court can still declare it unconstitutional. We have treaty-making powers. The United States, the governor, the executive branch can make the treaty, but it has to do it with the advice and consent of Congress. So it's on purpose. It's really amazing about how these work. They are jealously guarding their rights, but at the same time, they're forced to negotiate with each other. It's a moving parts type of thing. Thomas Jefferson didn't like that. Thomas Jefferson was in France during the Constitution, and he had some criticism. The Constitution originally didn't have a Bill of Rights, and he hated this separation of powers thing. He wanted a hardened separation.
He wanted to hardwire a clause in the federal Constitution.
And he didn't get it, but he got it in Kentucky.
He got it in Kentucky. Yeah.
So I'd urge you on some rainy night, when you're lonely and you have nothing left to drink, get out the Kentucky Constitution.
You should never have nothing left to drink.
Well, it depends on. But you ought to get out the Kentucky Constitution and take a look at it, because he's going to talk about, I guess, sections 26 and 27. Really interesting interplay between Jefferson, Senator Breckinridge, Nichols that we mentioned here. A real interesting cast of characters. Believe it or not, I'm going to shut up, but you can see how excited I am about the book itself. By the way, I forgot to say about his CV is that he graduated from Ballard, went to University of Kentucky undergrad, UK Law School. He practiced here in Louisville with Barnett and Leisure for a little while. He practiced with a number of
in government a long time. This fellow over here in a white shirt. Almost
with the Governor Patton's office. He was with Representative Chandler, right?
You worked
Yeah.
And
There's somebody else I mentioned, I forgot out of that.
Greg
Stumbo, attorney when he was Attorney General.
Did that a year and a half.
Yeah.
How many attorneys here? We got some.
Well, I think most of us here. He's now working in Washington D.C. with the National Health Group,
United Health Group.
United Health Group, I'm sorry.
We have the power behind attorneys here.
Yeah, that's right, that's the real attorneys.
Keep them in loop.
And you.
Okay, well, thank you for coming, and I'm gonna shut up, please.
Well, it's okay. You did a good job.
Thank you, Mark.
We need to get you to write a book. You wanna write a book with me? We'll come up with
I'd
a
love to.
topic. All right, you wanna move it to the next slide there? Okay, so there's the cover. Thomas Jefferson, the Kentucky Constitution. Stop it right there.
Right there?
I like that one, yeah. That portrait of Jefferson is from 1792. You can see he's got red hair and it's starting to get a little gray. This was his daughter's favorite portrait of Jefferson, Martha Jefferson Randolph. She thought that was the best, and the Houdon sculpture of Jefferson, she thought was overall the best likeness of him, but she thought it made him look a little old. That's in the front cover of the book, and she's very reliable. And when I was with Congressman Chandler, she thought that was the absolute best likeness of her dad. We were on the Appropriations Committee. We were on all sorts of subcommittees, and we were in the majority. And Mr. Billiken, he's passed away. He was the librarian of Congress, and he came over and he said, "Would you all like to come to the library someday and see some of our documents in the Madison building?" We said, "We sure would." He said, "Come up with 3 things you'd like to see." So Chandler and I came up with something. He said, "We want to see something related to Jefferson." And I said I wanted to see something related to President Kennedy, and Ben wanted to see something related to his grandfather, Happy Chandler, who was a 2-term governor, U.S. Senator, and Commissioner of Baseball. So we got over there. I wasn't going to tell the story, but I just thought about it when I looked at his hair. And we went into a room that was about 55 degrees. It couldn't have been colder. And the Librarian of Congress brought out a big box, a big gray, old cardboard box, and he opened it up. And there were 3 hair samples, clumps of hair. And it said, "Hair of Thomas Jefferson collected by his daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph." And one was when he was about this age, one was in his 60s, and one was when he passed away. And in every one of them, even the oldest one, you could see that red hair. For some reason, he came alive to me when I saw that. So it was an interesting story. But the other thing that's important about this picture, it was painted in 1792. That's the exact same year. Kentucky's Constitution was written in Danville, largely by George Nicholas. George Nicholas, who we'll talk about in a minute, worked with Jefferson, got elected to the Virginia House of Delegates in 1778, the same year Jefferson was elected governor. And they worked there in Richmond. So Thomas Jefferson, the Kentucky Constitution, let's stay right there. If you'd asked me what I knew about Jefferson before I wrote this book, I don't think I could have told you much. I knew I could have told you that he was president for 2 terms, which he was from 1801 to 1809. He wrote the Declaration of Independence we just celebrated when he was 34 in 1776. But he had a lot of other jobs, and he had a lot of interests. One of his interests was the mechanics of government. He was almost obsessed with this business you mentioned about separation of powers. How do you draw a line or a distinction between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches so one branch of government doesn't overlap with the other? He tried, but failed to get a separation of powers clause in the Constitution. Now we know this because when you look at the Federalist Papers, which is a good suggestion to read, Federalist 47 and 48, written by James Madison anonymously, he tries to talk everybody out of having another constitutional convention to put a separation of powers clause in it. That's how powerful Jefferson was, even though in 1787, when the Constitution was written, he was over in France. So he was just freaked out about separation of powers all the time. And you wonder why on earth is he like that? What is the big deal? But you have to remember where they were. They just fought a revolution for 8 years. They were mad about the judiciary. There's a great book that came out recently about the Boston Tea Party that sort of demonstrates that was somewhat about taxes, but it was also about judges. The Parliament in Great Britain had just passed an act that funded royalist judges all over the Northeast colonies, and they were having a fit about that. So Jefferson was not successful with the federal Constitution, but he was with Kentucky. So let's take Jefferson back from his jobs and sort of back into Breckinridge and George Nicholas. He was president for 2 terms, and before that he was vice president under John Adams. That was a tumultuous time. He and Adams were friends, and they weren't friends, and they were friends, and they died the same day. It's a really an odd history. But during that period, you know, we had the Alien and Sedition Acts, and we'll get to that in a minute. That's in the book, but that was a big deal at the time that called for the deportation of illegal aliens, and gosh, we passed the national property tax and tried to put the whole country on a war footing because we were starting to go to war with France. And Kentucky went crazy about the Alien and Sedition Acts because we had so many French folks that had immigrated here and Scotch Irish. They changed the time to be a citizen from 5 to 14 months, and people in Kentucky thought they were being targeted. So we went crazy. There were riots here in Lexington. There was a 10,000 person riot in Lexington in 1798. Jefferson worked with Nicholas and Breckinridge at the time, who was the Speaker of the Kentucky House, to write the Kentucky resolutions that opposed the Alien and Sedition Acts. So before he was Vice President, he was Secretary of State. He was Minister to France. But the job I could not have told you about until I really got into the book was Governor of Virginia. That's where he ran across Nicholas and Breckinridge. Now, the first time I ran across them is in this excerpt from a Kentucky Supreme Court opinion. It was called the Kentucky Court of Appeals from 1898, Commissioner of Sinking Fund versus George. I came across this when I was in Frankfurt's General Counsel to Governor Patton. We had a live controversy with the legislature over the prerogatives of the executive branch to issue administrative regulations. And the legislature was, despite the decision in LRC versus Brown that tried to roll that back, trying to attach conditions to our ability to promulgate regulations. So Cheryl Snyder, I'd not read the Kentucky Constitution. If I'd read it at that point in my life when I was 35, I sure don't remember it. But Cheryl Snyder had done a lot of that. He was an attorney, lead attorney in LRC versus Brown, represented Governor Brown in that case successfully. He came by to see me and he gave me a law journal article he wrote in 1984 called Separation of Powers in Kentucky's Constitution. He said, you need to read this because we're going to use it. So I read it, and I remember it had a statement in there that Thomas Jefferson wrote the first two clauses of Kentucky's first, second, and third Constitution. And those clauses are still in there as sections 27 and 28. They're simple, but we're the only state that has a bifurcated two-tiered separation of powers clause. And there are 8 other states that sort of have a version of it, and the rest of them don't have it at all. One of them says the powers of Kentucky's government are vested in the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The other one says that no one branch of government shall exercise any power properly belonging to the other. It sounds simple, but it's a big deal in Kentucky's legal history for those of you that have lived it. Bob Stevens, the Supreme Court, for 130 years has latched on to that bifurcated separation of powers clause and used it to protect the branches of government from each other. It was used in this, it was used in, remember the Rose versus Council for Better Education, Supreme Court case that rolled back Kentucky's antiquated unequal system of funding for elementary and secondary education system. It was a fantastic case. It really moved Kentucky into the almost 21st century, even though it was a 1989 case. That has 3 pages of this story, and that story about Jefferson, it said, oh, we need to pay attention to these clauses. We need to protect the branches. The judiciary can declare the educational system unconstitutional. The legislature said, no, that's our prerogative. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. And Bob Stevens rolled out this story and Jefferson and said Jefferson wrote these clauses. This little story says that Nicholas and John Breckinridge went to Monticello and he wrote the clauses and gave it to him. Now, I can't exactly prove that, but once I came across the Nicholas papers, I came pretty close to it up at the University of Chicago. So that, you know, this story has been used for years and years, but it finally got to where, about 20 years ago, the Supreme Court began to say, we're using this all the time, this story about Jefferson, but nobody's ever proved Jefferson had anything to do with it, or that George Nicholas had anything to do with it. So there's a footnote in a case, majority opinion by Justice Cooper on the Fletcher budget case. It invalidated Governor Fletcher's ability to do a budget by an executive order. And it said, here we are using we think it's a great decision, but here we are using this story again about Jefferson. Is there any proof out there that Jefferson had anything to do with it, or that Nicholas wrote these clauses? Then the barn burner was the lower court opinion several months ago in Shell versus Bashir. There was a justice with the Court of Appeals that wrote a dissent. It was 2-1. And it had to do with the legislature's enactment of a bill that gave them the prerogative to appoint ex officio members of the state fair board, located right here in Lowell. And the majority said, no, the legislature's encroaching on the prerogative of the executive branch, and we have it said a uniquely powerful separation of powers clause in our Constitution, and we can't do that. So the dissent said, we're relying again on this separation of powers thing as being a big deal, and then Jefferson wrote it, and Nicholas listened to what Jefferson said. There's no evidence of that, and it's a long historical, it's a 250-page dissent. It's one of the longest, I think, in Kentucky's history, and a good deal of it dealt with this story. So I saw that dissent when I was getting ready to push send on the book to the publisher. I added a coda at the end of the book trying to politely refute that. In the Supreme Court, what happened 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, Kentucky Supreme Court upheld the decision of the lower court. And what did they use? These clauses again, saying they're uniquely powerful. That's the biggest separation of powers case Kentucky's had, I think, since the Fletcher budget case. That was a big deal. It upheld the governor's prerogative to appoint people under his appointed powers and under separation of powers principles. So we want to flip to the, I can't believe I put that in there. That's Cheryl Snyder and myself over in Franklin, Kentucky, arguing these clauses on this budget case that I was just telling you about. When you came over there, I had to put it in there, I guess, so it's kind of fun. Want to do the next one? That's Wilson Carey Nicholas. I'm not sure what, that's in there because it's painted by Gilbert Stewart, who's probably one of the most famous portraits, very authentic. Everybody said he and Charles Wilson Peel, the main folks that made a good living off of painting the founders, but everybody said George Nicholas looked just like him, and there's no painting of George Nicholas, what he looked like. He was bald. So you want to flip to the next one, that's John Breckinridge and Isaac Shelby. Go one more. Yeah, Isaac Shelby was their first governor. Okay, well, stop right there. So that's what tipped me off about George Nicholas. So I started to say, who is George Nicholas? I've never heard of this character. When I read that story, what is the deal with him? So I started looking around, and Nicholas was an attorney. He was born in Williamsburg. His father was an attorney. His father had studied under George Wythe, who was the preeminent legal scholar of his time. Nicholas studied under Wythe. Jefferson studied under Wythe. John Marshall, our first Chief Justice for 40 years, studied under Wythe. And one of the last students George Wythe had was Henry Clay. That's how important that guy was. And they decided to get Nicholas to run to replace George Wythe, who wanted to retire. Nicholas won the seat, got elected 1778. His father died. Instead of moving to Richmond, the state capital, he moves to Charlottesville and buys a house 2.5 miles from Monticello. I think, and I posit in this book and the next book, that they had developed an incredible friendship. Wilson Carey Nicholas, who we just saw, was considered by Jefferson to be absolutely brilliant. He was his intermediary on the Alien Sedition Acts, the Kentucky resolutions. He ended up, Wilson Carey Nicholas's daughter married Jefferson's granddaughter. And Wilson Carey Nicholas was buried at Monticello. He's one of the few people other than the family members that were buried there. So that was the beginning of a close relationship between the Nicholas family, soon to be of Kentucky, particularly George Nicholas and Thomas Jefferson. So Nicholas moves to Charlottesville. He starts to incubate there in central Virginia, in the society and legally. He gets involved in the Virginia Constitutional Society with Jefferson and Madison and a bunch of people. They study the Virginia Constitution. They add a separation of powers clause to Virginia's Constitution. It's a simple one. It's not as elaborate as what he did in Kentucky. He works with Breckinridge on criminal justice reform. He starts to come to the attention of the founders, Madison and Washington. You can see from correspondence, people are saying this Nicholas is pretty darn sharp. And he does two things before he comes to Kentucky that really puts him on a high trajectory. The first thing, in 1784, he takes on Patrick Henry in the Virginia religious assessment dispute. Virginia, if you can believe it, was being proposed by Patrick Henry to impose a 5% surtax on every citizen to fund the Episcopal Church and ministers and to build churches. And Henry had a lot of power at the time. He'd been governor, and Nicholas went to George Washington. All of them went, oh, that's why we came over here to get away from that sort of stuff. We don't want to have state-sponsored religion. So Nicholas And Madison wrote about this and told people at a dinner party with Lafayette in 1826. I didn't have time to put this book, I'm putting it in my new book. And they're at Montpellier at his mansion in 1826. Lafayette's there, and Lafayette's secretary was taking notes of the conversation at the dinner. If you ever want to read something interesting, David, you like this book. Lavoisier is his name. He was 28 years old. He wrote every night about who he was seeing, who Lafayette was seeing. It's firsthand stuff written that evening, every evening, with Washington and Jefferson and all these people. He said, Madison told this story about how we almost lost freedom of religion. And he said there's a guy named G. Nicholas. He put G. Nicholas, he did save the day. Nicholas came up with the idea of a round robin or a petition. Historians think it was the first time anybody ever really came up with a political petition. Got thousands of people to sign it. Had a big old campaign and pamphlets, you know. He'd been all over the media and the internet nowadays and Instagram, and ended up getting that thing defeated just barely, by 4 or 5 votes. So then, the next thing he does, on the strength of that, Madison picks him, this is in Virginia, in Richmond, to be the floor manager for the Virginia Constitutional Ratification Convention in 1788. Remember what happened in Philadelphia in 1787 didn't matter if you didn't have 9 of the 13 states ratify the Constitution. They had 8 of them. And the next one up was Virginia. And Virginia was then the biggest colony in the country. It was sort of the engine of economic development. Most of the founders were from Virginia. And then they were going to go to New York. And they were almost certain going to lose New York. Alexander Hamilton was up there whitewashed and says, I'm up here and it doesn't look good. If you can't get it passed in Virginia, we're shot. And Washington said, we can't have it. We just fought a revolution. He literally said this, we got to fix it. Somebody's got to do something in Virginia. So then they end up, Madison lands on George Nicholas as his floor general. There's a series of letters. This is all in the next book. The next book is Showdown in Virginia. James Madison, Patrick Henry, and the debate to save the Constitution. But Nicholas there's 6 letters they exchange on their strategy. And Nicholas starts to write people in Kentucky, because he'd heard rumors that Kentucky may be difficult. The Kentucky delegation, we were part of Virginia at the time. And Madison says, well, we got to fix that. From what I hear, we may not have enough votes. So they show up in Richmond. Madison said, Nicholas is appointed to be the floor manager. He's working with other people. He works with James Monroe's on the other side. He works with John Marshall. There's Patrick Henry on this other side, and Edmund Wilson, and Randolph, and all the George Mason, who wrote Virginia's first Constitution with Jefferson. It was the biggest battle royale for 3 weeks. And Nicholas is the floor manager of the thing, battling again Patrick Henry, who's in charge of the Anti-Federalists. It wants to tank the Constitution. He basically, Madison wrote Washington 3 days after convention, I think he wants to go back to armed insurrection. I think he wants to tank the whole thing and have another revolution. And Washington writes him, can we get on it? Can we fix it? And Madison says, I'm trying. He said, Nicholas is my best vote getter, and he's working on it, but he tells me we got a problem with Kentucky. So they get to the convention. Nicholas starts to battle Henry. The very first day, the argument is about, Henry says it shouldn't be we the people, it should be we the states. And he gives an argument about states' rights. And they battle about independence of the judiciary. And they argue about the executive branch and powers to raise an army. And the thing goes on for weeks and weeks. And the independence of the judiciary. People in Virginia had been burned by property disputes, just like Alexander Bullitt here in Jefferson County. When it came time to have the 1792 Constitutional Convention in Danville, Alexander Bullitt, from the Bullitt family, they, for good reasons, just said, I want to have the legislature in charge of the judiciary. He says, I've been burned by these loyalist judges for too long. He felt he got messed over on all sorts of property disputes. And Nicholas said, the judiciary has to be completely independent. But there are vestiges of that feeling today in a lot of state constitutions. South Carolina to this day has a provision the legislature has approval over who's appointed to the Supreme Court and the appellate courts. It's a fascinating system. But long story short, Nicholas is the hero at the ratification convention. It's a big drama. It's the subject of the next book. He battles it out. People in Kentucky start to really like him. He's able to peel off 6 Kentucky votes and 3 or 4 from Virginia, and gets the Constitution approved. Madison is so nervous in the process, 3 days into the event, He gets sick. He goes home, he writes Washington, he says, I'm sick. I can't, he said, but I've left it up to Nicholas. Then he comes back for a few days, he gets sick again. Madison is about 5'4", weighs 105 pounds, but he lived to be 86. He lived longer than any of the founders. He kept living and living, but he had what he self-diagnosed as epilepsy, and he had some stomach disorders. So whenever it happened in the War of 1812, whenever he got stressed, he got sick. He shut down, really. So there's Nicholas battling out. So this speech is 2 days before the vote. And here he is. This is verbatim. They had two people transcribing the thing, and the records match almost up. Somebody up in the gallery. This is the biggest thing going on in the country. If this was happening today, it'd be on Urban Network. And he sort of comes out and says, he tells everybody for the first time, I'm moving to Kentucky. Why would I be behind a deal that's going to mess up, that's going to hurt Kentucky? Kentucky can expect support alone from strong efficient government that can command the resources of the Union when necessary. That country, Kentucky, contains all my wishes and prospects. There's my property. He had already bought property. He wrote his brother when he got to Kentucky, if you ever come to Kentucky, don't buy property before you come here. He said, because I did it. But he came to Kentucky, and he never moved back. He had 9 kids, and Madison kept trying to get him to come back. And he said, no, I like Kentucky too much. I'm staying here. He settled in an area now called Castleton Farms, northeast of Lexington. He almost settled here. So he gives that speech. They have the big vote. The Constitution's approved, 89 to 79. So you want to flip to the next one. So now we're getting into, I'm way down the road. I thought I'd written a pretty good book that demonstrated George Nicholas was influenced by Jefferson, largely from the correspondence of Nicholas, Jefferson, Madison, and Washington. So a few days after the Virginia Ratification Convention, Nicholas writes Madison, says, I'm going to Kentucky. They want me to help with their Constitution, write it for them. I like those fellas. They're an honorary bunch. Remember, they opposed the federal Constitution because they didn't think the federal government was doing enough to protect them in this area, all the way to Lexington, from Indian incursions. And they wanted to have rights of navigation on the Mississippi and the Ohio River. The government, through John Jay, had signed a treaty with Spain that gave Spain rights of navigation on the Ohio, here. And they were worried that, Spain would set up an office here in Louisville and charge tariffs for them when we would export our tobacco and things. And it was a huge, Kentucky delegation was down the road. And Nicholas basically is saying, I'm not going to let it happen. I'll be there. That's where I'm moving. And I'll make sure everything's protected. So he peeled off just those folks. But so when I was just about finished with the book, David Niehaus, who's here today, said, are you sure you've looked enough at George Nicholas and found everything you can find on him? I'd just keep digging on Nicholas and see what you can find. So I kept digging. I said, well, I found everything I can find. I think I've written a good book. I mean, it's not the Grapes of Wrath or anything, but I think it'll say, He said, why? I don't know if you all would know, he said, well, I just keep looking. So I kept looking. So one night, I'm at my place in Florida. It's about 11 o'clock at night, and I came across the papers of George Nicholas that had just been digitized and put up on the internet at the University of Chicago. I said, what in the world? So I stayed up till 2 or 3 in the morning scrolling through these, and I found these boxes labeled my speech at the Constitutional Convention, notes for the Constitutional Convention, what should be in Kentucky's Constitution, his own handwritten drafts of Kentucky's Constitution. I said, well, this is the thing that proved all these cases that don't fit. I think this might be the mother load of proof here. And then one of the things I came across, so these papers, by the way, were collected by Reuben Durrett from here in Louisville. Reuben Durrett was one of the founders of the Filson Historical Society. And Durrett was the editor of the Louisville Courier-Journal. He was an attorney and an amateur historian. So when he retired, for some reason, he went around Kentucky collecting historical papers. He came across the papers of Nicholas, kept them for years, cataloged them, was getting ready to sell them to the Filson Club. And he fell out with the new Filson board or something. They wouldn't pay him enough. Then he had a stroke here in Louisville. It was 1914, and he ended up selling the papers to the University of Chicago. His family did right after he died, although he approved it, for $28,000, which, well, I don't know what that, I think I figured it out at one point, $600,000 or $700,000 in today's money. Pretty good. So he saw, but they've been sitting up there, and they've just been digitized, and I found page after page of his handwriting. For example, this is the handwritten notes of his, for his speech, his first speech in Danville in 1792 when they're getting the Constitution together. What does he talk about? He talks about liberty and justice and all this, but these things that I underline here in it and down here are separation of powers. People are free, let them, but Solomon delivered act delegates such powers to the three departments, only as necessary to preserve their rights and happiness, retain all others in their own hands. Let the Constitution limit their power, assign each department its appropriate duty, and prevent either from infringing upon the rights of the people or invading the province of the other. That's the clause where he's basically writing it right there in his speech. So flip to the next one. This is the Rosetta Stone of the book, to the extent people, care about it. You wonder sometimes if people even care about this stuff. I don't. For those of you that are here, some of you might be interested in it. So I found this, and I have no idea what's going on with it. So I submit this thing to Princeton. I asked the scholars at the University of Chicago. Long story short, this is a page from Madison's reply, finally, after a year and a half, to George Nicholas. George Nicholas is interlineating some things here. I have that sort of translated in one of the next slides, but stay right here for now. Then at the bottom, I noticed throughout all of his stuff on the Danville Convention, he has Jefferson and a number, Jefferson 195. So I said, well, I found what this is about. This place right in the book. And the publisher said, well, hold it up, put it in the book. And I called the folks at the Chicago Library, the curators. I said, what are these numbers? They said, we don't know. Give us. So I waited a week, 2 weeks. I called them, emailed them. Finally, they called back and said, we figured it out. He's referring to page 195 from Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. It's exactly what Nicholas had written Madison about before he came to Kentucky and said, I'm using Jefferson's notes from the state of Virginia to write Kentucky's Constitution and doing what Jefferson said. Remember, he worked for Jefferson, basically. They were close friends. And he said, I'm using Jefferson's notes in the state of Virginia. So when I went to page 195, it's one page of a 21-page essay about how important it is for state constitutions to have separation of powers clauses. He thought it was important. Remember, Madison said, no, it doesn't matter. Nobody cares about that. The courts will sort it out. And Jefferson said, no, we fought too much to not have it in there. He said, I believe the courts will use it defensively and offensively to protect, which is exactly what Kentucky's done. Kentucky, if you look at all the opinions, that's exactly how we acted. And so I remember I wrote him and I said, how do we know that's from Jefferson's notes in the state of Virginia? He said, oh, this is the page from Nicholas's copy of the notes in the state of Virginia. They were in his box. He had annotated it. He had his name on the front cover. I said, okay, I believe it. I'll take it. So they sent me some more photos. I didn't want to load up the book with photos and people just, don't even want to read it. But if you want to flip to the next one there. This is just another page from Madison wrote him an 84-page essay. If you ever want to read something fascinating, if you go try to see the Nicholas papers today, they're now down. They're not up. There are references to them. You can get permission for free to see them. They're trying to get an NIH grant to restructure the Nicholas papers so they can be even more available publicly. And they're tough to get into and figure it out. You scroll through them. I must have spent 100 hours or more fiddling with them and getting permission to use it. But they're fascinating if you can get in there and really interested in some history. I wrote a letter. They asked me to write a letter to the NIH to support their grant application. I hope they get it. But this is a little snippet of a piece on separation of powers, and Madison himself had written Jefferson's name there. We'll go to the next one. That's Nicholas's handwriting. Your eyeballs might pop out trying to read his handwriting. It's the craziest thing I've ever seen. But I got to where I could figure it out, and then I put it through ChatGPT over and over to try to get the translation of it. There he is in another essay. So there's Jefferson 126.7.8. So I called Chicago. I said, what's that number? That number in the other edition is something about the flowers of Virginia. It had nothing to do with the government. They said, oh, that's another edition. There's the London edition and the Paris edition. It's the same pages, just a different edition. If you ever write a book, come talk to me. You just lose your mind. Little things like that happening all throughout the whole book. Let me go to the next. There he is again, using that same. I'm gonna flip another one. Those are hash marks. He's using that in the convention, I think, his hash marks are as he's going through reading stuff and engaging in debate. That's a page from the book where I translate that first page on the Rosetta Stone there that I call it. That the government whose powers are mixed with its sole advantage. By dividing the power into different hands, you're certain that one of them will oppose any improper steps of the other. There are pages and pages of this. He can't stop writing about it. That's how important he was. So you can imagine Nicholas, who was well known to everybody, Kentucky hired him basically because he did such a darn good job in Virginia at the Constitutional Convention. He managed to get his point home and get the Constitution written the way he wanted it to be written. Okay, what's the next? Here's one where he's talking about the legislative power, not encroaching on the executive. It's a long essay in there. I'm gonna flip to the next one. I have that one in there. That's just to prove, I didn't put it in the book, but it's to prove to people that is Nicholas's handwriting, because that's one of the few letters that's around where he actually signed his name. Go one more. And there it is. So this is a page from the copy that was in Madison's papers that Nicholas sent to James Madison. He sent the same one to Jefferson. It was printed there in Lexington by John Bradford. John and Fielding Bradford had about the only printing press in Kentucky at the time. It was in Lexington. The number at the bottom is 1792. It was mailed in June, a few weeks after they wrote it. The next page, I believe. And there's proof of it right there. They're the first two sections. Government's divided into distinct departments. No person shall exercise any power belonging to the other one. Yeah. So it made it. It's the only state that has it like that. Okay, if you want to flip to one more. Oh, I forgot I put this in here. Yeah, I raised the question here is whether separation of powers clause would have mattered if we had one in the federal constitution. You know, mere words on part. Madison wrote the Federalist Papers along with Hamilton and Jay. But Madison, who really liked Jefferson, took off after Jefferson and the Federalist Papers on this separation of powers issue. He says it's just words, you know, on parchment. It doesn't matter. But remember when he wrote the Federalist, he's trying to get the Constitution ratified. It was a PR document, really. And he thought Jefferson's ideas were going to slow down ratification of the Constitution. That's the idea behind, because he later wrote that essay that we just saw back to Nicholas saying, follow Jefferson, put separation of powers in there. But he was in a panic, as was Washington and other people. And remember, Jefferson's over in France in 1787. He's writing letters. He told Jefferson later, he said, I wrote you 6 letters of what I thought should be in there. A lot of what he wanted a Bill of Rights, which eventually got in there. That was a compromise at the Virginia Ratification Committee. That's in the next book. Henry and some of the others wanted a Bill of Rights also. So we ended up getting one. There's the 56 article Bill of Rights that was passed at the Virginia Ratification Convention. Of course, it ended up being much shorter in our federal version. This references a couple of recent cases, Loper Bright and Jercasey. I can't even remember. Jercasey it validated the SEC civil enforcement scheme. So a fellow named Jercasey had been accused of insider trading and selling stock with an inside tip. And he went through the whole adjudicatory process and fined him $350,000. And his lawyer said, we ought to challenge this. There's no authority in the regulation for this to happen. So it goes all the way to the Supreme Court and it says that violates separation of powers. The executive branch created a court system administratively with no instruction from Congress. Your remedy is in the courts. Jercasey, you don't have to pay the fine. It's an interesting case. Loper Bright was a sardine fisherman. Poor fellows are up there in Oregon. They challenged a regulation, Maritime Fisheries Division or something, that required sardine fishermen twice a month to pay for a federal inspector to come on their boat to see if they exceeded the catch limits. And they said, we can't find where there's any authority to do this. There's no, in Supreme Court, Justice Roberts, he said, you're right. There's no authority to do that. Invalidated the whole scheme. Regulatory system run wild. Executive went too crazy. So this is just sort of playing with there's Shell versus Bashir. I wrote an amicus with Cheryl Snyder in that case. It's in the case toward the end. Cheryl's reference. Talking about separation of powers. So, yeah. Want to flip to the next one? So that's sort of the legacy of, okay, so this is about the Alien Sedition Acts. The purpose of that in the book is to show continuity within 6 years of 1782. There's Nicholas again with John Breckinridge, who is on his way to eclipsing Nicholas, and becoming a real political power in Kentucky and nationally, working with Jefferson to write the Kentucky resolutions in opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts. You want to flip one more? It's hard to see. Hell, I could hardly get it reviewed. This is an article in Lexington. It's about the riot in Lexington. There are 10,000 people. It's the last speech Nicholas ever gave. He was heavy. He was big. He had a hard time walking. He was 46. He gave a speech. He got knocked off the platform, fell off, hurt himself. Henry Clay gave a speech. They're all giving speeches against the Alien and Sedition Acts because Kentucky fell. A lot of Scotch Irish and French. Remember the French heritage in Kentucky? We got LaGrange, which is named after Lafayette's estate. We've got Versailles, Bourbon County. What else we got? Paris County. Anybody come up from Nova? Fayette. Louisville. King Louis. It's on and on. Well, if you go back, these names were there back then. So imagine here, people are like, what the hell, I know a bunch of French people here, and there are a lot of Scotch Irish in Louisville, German community. A lot of the German community came around 1840s, but there were plenty here at the time, and they didn't like that. It was a big deal. This thing, there were fist fights and riots and everything imaginable. And I went back, I got it in the book of 10,000 people according to the Gazette. I don't know how they count them, but the population of Fayette County was 14,000. Anytime you can turn out most of the darn town, people are upset about it. Breckinridge was there, Henry Clay. Henry Clay was interning for Breckinridge, who had a law office there in Lexington. So Isaac Shelby wrote a letter to Adams and said, I just wanted you to know. He says, I wanted you to know that Kentucky is completely ablaze. If it isn't ablaze, it could be worse. He said, we've got a real problem here, and you need to help us get a handle on it. He said, I don't know where it's going to go. So the Kentucky resolutions passed unanimously, both chambers. There was a little argument. It's nullification. It says Kentucky, we're still in the Union, but we're not going to do what Congress tells us to do. He said there's going to be no enforcement here as far as we're concerned. So and then Virginia passed the same thing, and Madison secretly worked with Jefferson on that. Remember, Jefferson's vice president. He's writing the Kentucky resolution. Now we do know he did that for sure, because there's correspondence and letters. He used Wilson Carey Nicholas as the courier to come to Kentucky and bring more revisions. He had a letter. He said, I've got a new tweak in the resolutions. He sent it all the way to George Nicholas. Nicholas's health is not doing too good. He gave it to Breckinridge, and the Kentucky resolutions passed. But one more slide. I think why do I have that in there? That's the appointment of Breckinridge, I think, to be. So Breckinridge, came to Kentucky. He was the hero of the 1799 convention. He kept the separation of powers clauses in there. He had a lieutenant governor and some other things. Remember, he got elected the same year to the Virginia House of Delegates as Nicholas, except he got elected when he was 20. I start off the book telling the story. He violated Virginia's Constitution. It said you had to be elected, and you had to get elected and be eligible to serve when you're 21. He got elected when he was 20. I double checked it. I went and checked on the Virginia Library and all this stuff. He violated by about 6 months, but they said to hell with it. He was on his way to maybe being a vice presidential candidate, if not a presidential candidate. He was a real powerhouse. Kentucky's lucky to have had two super bright people come here and help form the country. He became Attorney General later, but he was Kentucky's senator after he was Speaker of the House. And he led the floor fight to get Louisiana Purchase approved. Jefferson went nuts. He was a strict constructionist. He says, no, we're going to have to amend the Constitution. The Constitution only says we can admit new states. This is a territory. Breckinridge says, forget about it. This is big, $15 million, so what? $15 million was like a third of the nation's budget. We went into debt. Jefferson didn't want to go into debt. He'd been through the XYZ affair, which is started the quasi-war. That just happened a few years before over our debt. But he convinced, there's some fascinating correspondence, some of that's in the book, about how he turns the tables and convinces Jefferson to let it go. Breckinridge was brilliant. He was a litigator, he was a land lawyer expert. He loved to write legislation. Jefferson, you can find notes from Jefferson that he would send through his secretary inviting Breckinridge when Breckinridge was in town. Breckinridge lived here northeast of Lexington most of the time. He said, come over tonight, French chef has a great dinner for us. I've got some legislation I've been writing. This is Jefferson, this is fascinating. That I want you to look at and tinker with, work with it and see if we can get it passed in Congress. So they had a standing dinner, 1 or 2 nights a week. And then one night he asked him, he said, his Attorney General got sick and retired and wanted him to be Attorney General. So Breckinridge closed out his career as Attorney General to Jefferson. He only did it for about 1.5 years. I cover some of the cases, some of the things he did. He's not sure he wanted to leave the Senate because he was Jefferson's floor leader on the floor of the Senate, but he left. And then he got tuberculosis, and he never did. He came to Kentucky. We think he caught it. There was an epidemic in Kentucky at the time. I mentioned some of it in the footnote. A lot of people passed away from it at that time, and he died, when was it? 1806. He was 46, 47 years old. And there's some of the last letters are from Jefferson to him. Where are you? I gotta have you up here. He's right, he said, I'm trying. I'm not feeling good. And his wife was writing people saying he's coughing all the time. He tried to get on his horse and fell off. This guy looked like Clark Gable. Everybody said he was very imposing. Nicholas was the opposite. Bald, very heavy, kind of ruddy in complexion, incredible voice, and just brilliant. These two sort of interesting pairs of opposites really launched Kentucky and got it on a good path. So what's our next? Bob Stevens is in there because he told the Jefferson story 6 times. I've talked to when I was writing the book, I won't say her name, some of you here may know her. His long-serving clerk of court, she said, he loved that Jefferson story. He had to put it in every opinion. I said, yeah, did anybody ever research whether? No, he just took it from that old case. Okay, so the next one, I don't know why, that's Jefferson's 1821. That's a distinguished, in color, that really looks pretty good. That's Jefferson when he was older, painted with Monticello. Can't remember why I put that in there. This is a dinner. We've got to close out on this. So we had a big whoop-de-whoop back in 1998, 99, just when Governor Patton was getting ready to start his second term. I was the general counsel. We got all the governors together, the governor's mansion, and the topic was constitutional reform. And everybody wanted to have a constitutional convention. And Ned Breathitt's not in there. There's Louis Nunn, there's John Y. Brown, Patton, most of these people have passed away. Julian Carroll, me back over there with Crit Llewellyn, and there's Steve. And they're all there. They're all the former governors. It was the second biggest gathering of former governors in the nation's history, except for one they had in Virginia. And remember, a lot of them, we only had 1 term. Just had 4 years. But Governor Breathitt talked us out of it. He said, I went through it in the early 60s. It's the biggest darn mess you've ever seen. Kentucky's Constitution, you have to have a convention, then you have to put it on the ballot twice, and the General Assembly has to approve it twice. It takes too long. Even though there was a court decision, Matthews versus something back then, that said we think you can drive around that. The Supreme Court sort of gave some pretty broad permission that you could sort of nullify that whole process on the logic that the Bill of Rights says what the people want is superior. If the people vote on it, you don't have to keep running them, into the ground, submitting it to them. And sort of said there's an end run if you really wanted to do it. Long story short, we ended up going through the whole process and putting, because we had super majorities, in both chambers, a little bit like is now. Of course, if Comer's elected, it'll be just like we were with Patton, or somebody else is elected, Rocky Adams or Jacqueline. She'll probably still have a Republican legislature. But we debated for about 5 hours one night after dinner whether we should. Louis Nunn got in an argument there with Ned Breathitt over open housing, executive orders, started yelling at each other, and the governor had to interrupt them. And I was sitting next to Martha Lane Collins, and they were just going at it. The Breathitt, and all over the 1964 open housing executive order. And Martha Lane Collins leaned into me and said, Dennis, aren't you glad you came to this dinner? I said, yes, ma'am, I'm having a great time. But it was, that was the last big run at trying to have a constitutional convention. Now, we've amended the Constitution several times since then. And what was the next? I can't remember what else I got. I am trying to talk on KET. We don't need to look at that. Go that. I think that's it. Yeah, there we go. Effectively researched. Thanks, Cheryl. It was fun. Thank you all. I appreciate you all being interested in the book. If you have any questions, or if anybody wants a copy, you can have it while it lasts. The next book is will be published January 5. Go down in Virginia. A little longer. I think more of a drama. Great. Yeah.
So Jefferson did the Kentucky resolutions.
Yeah.
Was he actually directly involved with our Constitution, or was he just an influence for Nichols?
I would say he was much more of an influence, but what I was able to demonstrate is that he heavily influenced it. And the evidence of that is in the notes of the state of Virginia, his passion for it, what Madison worried about in his essay in the Federalist Papers, the fact that you have no idea how hard I looked at their records trying to see if he actually did make the darn trip to Monticello, may have gotten it, like that story said. I never could nail down any proof of that story in that footnote. But his papers go a long way, I think, to demonstrate it. There's also, I just didn't have room to put it in there, his own handwriting, writing those two clauses, in Nicholas's handwriting. That you can still see to this day if you can get access to the papers. I'm sorry they're all down, but I never did find any absolute proof that he sat there and wrote it and gave it to him and said, do it this way. But it's pretty darn close.
Why do you care so much about Kentucky?
Who, Jefferson?
Yeah.
Well, Kentucky was one of the first big chunks of territory to break off. You didn't want, see, the real danger was Kentucky's just, and they threatened to do it, we'd have our own darn country. Heck with it. Part of the day, I bring out in the next book, part of what Nicholas says, I only have that one little excerpt, but he speaks next to Patrick Henry, my God, these guys speak for an hour or two. You can just try to read it yourself, it lasts forever. They were fearful that Kentucky would, and Nicholas says, you say you want to be your own state in Kentucky. Hey, what are you gonna do? You gonna impose tariffs on everybody and northern Kentucky and down near Paducah and Louisville? How are you gonna, what's gonna be your tax base? You're gonna tax the hell out of everybody. Who's gonna be in the military? How are you gonna run it? You're gonna have to have a treaty with us, and we're gonna tax you too when you send your goods down through the other states. He plays it out pretty hard, and they came to realize, well, maybe we should go along with it. Some of them didn't, but he wanted to make sure once Kentucky did it and got into the Union, that it'd be part of the program, get with it. So he was fearful. They were all thinking about, the Louisiana Purchase came up, and it's just fascinating to see how the country kind of bolted on all these territories. But it's a fight all along the way. And remember, you always think that, these founders of being all gray haired and they look like they're in my age or older or something. They're all in their 20s and 30s, 40s at best. And you all work with young people. They're battling it out all the time. And they're very young folks that are, Patrick Henry was one of the oldest fellows at the Virginia Ratification Convention. It's 56. George Wythe showed up. He was 66. He was the oldest person there. And Nicholas, it's fascinating really if you're interested. So at the very end, the last speaker that Edmund Randolph, who ran the convention, let speak was, Nicholas told him, he said, I want Wythe to close it out. So Wythe gets up and talks less than anybody. It's like 20 minutes. He said, you're going to blow the whole thing if you don't approve it. He says, Kentucky, you need to come along with it. It's a pretty dramatic speech from Wythe. He was the oldest person. You go back and look at most of the rest of them, they're James Monroe, their former two-term president. He was in his 20s. Wilson Carrick Nicholas Monroe was a big hero of the Revolutionary War. Got his arm shot off at Trenton in Washington's position. Saved him with some new type of tourniquet. And he wrote Washington a week after Virginia Ratification Convention. He said, well, we lost, but it was a fair fight, and I think we did the right thing. He said the fellow that really made it happen was George Nicholas. Well, to me, Nicholas ought to be in the rotunda or something. But nobody's ever heard of him. You don't hear anything about it. So I'm trying to, maybe this next book will sell more. I did all right with this book, better than I thought it'd do. Gotta go on Instagram a lot. Anything Anyhow, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Did you say are you selling?
You can have it. Anybody that wants one, come up and get it.
Well,
I brought a few, I had several.